to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm Greg Spatz. I'm here with Trevor Rappa and Doug
Hello.
Kachujan. This is our first Keep It Real talk is what we're calling it. So just going to be the three of us talking about any sort of questions that were sent in from listeners, from blog readers, Instagram followers, whoever found us and sent in some questions. We'll talk about anything that we have so far with that. And we call it Keep It Real because of one of our more influential mentors, Alan Groover. We all did a clinical rotation as PT students with him in Arizona. That was just something that it was sort of like his mantra, his motto to live by in this world where everything can be so complicated in the field of rehab and sports performance or training. And a lot of his, we'd be in the clinic and asking him questions, and we'd have to have these thought processes in our head of like, we need to do something really out there and special for this patient in front of us. And he would always just bring it back to, okay, look, what do they need? Keep it real, and let's just get them what they need. And no matter what it is, or, what clinical or what, Con Ed courses you've taken, you just got to get the person what they need, and let's just keep it real. So that's what we're talking about when we say keep it real, and let's just get into some of these questions here. But Trevor, Doug, anything to start?
No, I think that was a great explanation. Yeah, we just always about keeping it real and trying to keep things as simple as we can and not overcomplicate it for the sake of just, making ourselves sound smart or just for the sake of making it more complicated.
Yeah. All right. So what question do I want to go over first here? Let's see.
Do you want to do the questions first or the execution thing?
Let's just quickly answer some of these questions. I don't think they're going to be too long, but we can kind of take it from there. And if it turns into two different Keep It Real talks, then so be it.
Cool.
So let's go. The first one, Doug, you want to talk about this question: is aerobic deficiency syndrome a thing? And if so, how can one recover from it? Is it high volume of slow cardio? You want to just take that and run?
Yeah, so aerobic deficiency syndrome, it's funny because I actually had to look that up because I hadn't heard it worded in that way. But essentially what it means is for someone training for like an endurance type event, that they're doing too much high intensity training and not enough of the lower intensity or more aerobic type training. So that's kind of what we mean by aerobic deficiency syndrome. And again, I hadn't heard it worded in that way, but ultimately it comes down to like what the goal is. So first of all, like even the aerobic system, right? Is that really a thing? Is it really a thing to say something is aerobic, anaerobic, glycolytic, phosphocreatine? These are all like words and constructs that we create to make this idea of bioenergetics more manageable. In biology, like when animals are running away from other animals, they're not thinking like, well, is this aerobic or is it anaerobic? They're just doing what they have to do to survive. And I think that it's important to learn energy systems, but I think they have limitations. I think that's just like any other model. That's one way to look at performance, in this case, conditioning or endurance, through this energy system lens. I think that and if we're keeping it like really, really brief, the way that I would summarize energy systems is that you can call them whatever you want, but ultimately, depending on what your goal is from an output standpoint, that's going to change the relative balance of all these different chemical reactions that produce energy. And when we're producing energy, there's always a trade-off between efficiency and speed. So if you want to produce energy really, really quickly, like you're sprinting, you can only do that for so long before you burn out. If you want to be more efficient and not produce it as quickly, i.e. you're being more aerobic, which is what we typically associate with that, then you're not going to be able to produce energy as rapidly. So there's always a trade-off, just like in any other biological system. So with the aerobic deficiency syndrome, I know who asked the question. So without kind of getting like too personal, revealing his details and his goals, this is somebody who's training for a military selection course where you have to do a lot of long distance running. And his training prior to us working together was a lot of higher intensity type work. And there are some systems that even say for an endurance event, whether it's like marathon, military selection, that you don't need to do any of the longer, lower intensity type work. You can just do intervals. And certainly for example, if you're training for a marathon, anybody can like finish a marathon, but the people who are winning the marathons tend to do a blend of high intensity work and low intensity work. I think the person who's kind of explained this the most clearly from all the reading that I've done is Steve Magnus. And Steve Magnus talks about when you're training for endurance, it's obviously context specific, because endurance for a military special operations selection course is different than endurance for like a 400-meter runner. So that 400-meter runner, there are people who train for the 400 and never run more than 200 meters in practice and are still pretty successful. When people start training for the 800 and above, it's kind of hard to just run 200 meters because you need more of an aerobic or a low end buffer. But what Steve Magnus says is you basically just take whatever it is that you want to do. So in this case, running, training for a military selection course where you're going to do anything from like, 6-mile time runs to 20-mile rucks or hikes through adverse terrain with external load or a pack. So you have to support those energetic demands on the high intensity end and the low intensity end. You need bandwidth, because you could say like, oh, well, if I want to train for whatever the 400, I could just do 400s. And that'll work to a point, which is kind of like saying intervals will work to a point. But if you don't support the low end and the high end, then it makes it then you burn out with that specificity. So for aerobic, having a well-developed aerobic system makes a lot of sense for a military selection candidate, because you're doing 6-mile runs. So if all you're doing is 400-meter repeats, you've never actually run for the duration that you're going to get tested on. So it's probably a good idea, if you're training for that kind of a thing, to do runs of even up to 10 miles, but at a lower intensity than what you would run when you were being timed. If you're only doing 400-meter repeats and then you put a ruck on and you go and walk 20 miles, like, yeah, there's a chance you can do it, but are you really going to be prepared? So I think that rather than looking at it as like being aerobic or anaerobic, I think that can be useful. But what's more important is to say that like whatever event you want to do, you need to support it with lower intensity work and support it with higher intensity work. And then as you get kind of closer to your competition or whatever it is that you're trying to prepare for, then you can do more specific work. But you need lower and higher intensity work on the front and the back end to support the specific work. Because the converse of that is like there are plenty of people who all they do is low intensity work. But like, let's say your goal is to run, you're a recreational runner and your goal is to run a 5K at a 7-minute mile pace. But right now you're only running 10-minute miles and you can do that all day. Like you can't even run one 7-minute mile. So how are you going to run 3 if you don't have enough speed to develop the ability to run one 7-minute mile? So for that person who can run 10-minute miles all day, it makes sense to do some speed work, which again is a relative construct. So speed work for somebody who wants to run a 7-minute mile might be doing 800-meter repeats at a 3:30 pace. And then you can manipulate the rest periods in between repeats. You could, demand a higher output on each repeat. There's a lot of ways to manipulate that, but you need speed and you need lower intensity work to support the specific demands. So for someone who's training for a true endurance event, like a military selection course, if I was preparing somebody, I would do way more than just interval work or high intensity work, because having done this stuff myself, it's a unique stress to go out and walk for 20 miles and running sprints and doing like a bunch of higher rep lifting. I don't think is a way to adequately prepare for that. So yes, like aerobic work is important, depending on how you define aerobic work, but it depends on your goal. And some people are going to need a lot more of it. The lower intensity of like your event or sport, so to speak, the more of that like quote unquote aerobic work you're going to need to do. So for a military selection course, I think that actually aerobic work should form the bulk of your training, and it should be supplemented only in small pieces with higher intensity work.
Yeah,
How important, Doug?
Go ahead, Trevor.
How important, Doug, do you think, like from your own experience in terms of, really getting a lot of that low intensity work in, is just like the tissue tolerance that you're kind of building up in tissue capacity to handle your crazy, 24-hour training periods where you're on your feet all day and just kind of, and you know what I mean, where you're constantly moving and you really have to have a high level of tissue capacity. Do you think that's important, or do you think that's kind of overrated for something like this?
I actually don't think it's overrated at all. I think that really training for like a military selection course in particular, like being able to meet the run times and the push-up times and the pull-up times isn't really that hard. the hard part is like being able to survive the training, because the training is very, very volume based. And if you haven't stressed yourself enough in training where volume is the stimulus, or is the major stimulus, then how are you going to deal with that volume when you have to go to the course? So I think the tissue tolerance thing is a great point, where like, yes, from maybe like a physiological standpoint, like whether it's cardiac output or like local muscular adaptations, like, yeah, you can run a bunch of 400s and
Right.
like, you're not going to gas out on a ruck per se, but if your body's not used to rucking for 20 miles, then maybe like when you do it, then like, you know, you have an overuse injury, like in your Achilles or your lower leg, or even a stress reaction, right? Because if you're not used to, for example, in a selection course, you run almost 5-6 miles a day just to get places, because you're not allowed to walk anywhere. So that doesn't even count as your actual run training. You have to run to your meals. You've got to run to the dorms, all these different things. So you're running almost like 30 miles a week just as your means of transportation. So if you're only doing lower intensity work, like now your body's not conditioned for that kind of volume. So I think that what you said is that tissue tolerance is a huge piece. And that's why like all these models, you have like your tissue preparation model, your physiological model, your cardiac model, they all kind of have to be addressed, because physiologically, I think you can, with lower intensity work, you can like quote unquote prepare, you know, from a conditioning standpoint for some of these longer things. But then it's also like even from like a technique standpoint, like you could say that like these runners who are doing these like, you know, slow runs multiple times a week, were at a really low intensity. A lot of coaches will say, well, that's just junk mileage, but that's also, you know, they're also developing the ability to run technically. They're getting so many exposures to running, they become really efficient at running, and they become good at running. You can almost think of it as like it's practice, a sport practice done at a low intensity, where their sport is just to run, and then they can increase their output once they've developed that technique. So there's a lot of components that need to be addressed. It's not just like, you know, how do you test in a 6-mile run? It's, are your tissues prepared for it? Are you biomechanically and technically prepared for it? And that's why I think that like if you're playing a volume-based sport, you need volume to know that you're prepared for it. It's just basic stress inoculation, and you've got to attack the physiology, the tissues, the mechanical stuff, you know, all of the above. And it's also why, you know, like a lot of dancers, for example, do a ton of like low load, long duration stretching. And people, you know, especially in strength and conditioning, can say, well, that's a waste of time. Just do dynamic stretching and PNF. But like, there's probably a reason why, you know, dancers spend a lot of time static stretching. And until a strength coach is hitting the ranges of motion as a dancer by just doing, you know, contract, relax, and dynamic stretching, we need to kind of keep our egos in check, because, you know, we can make athletes worse. And a lot of times, like, we need to look at what athletes are doing in their sport that makes them successful. And there's a reason why like distance runners aren't just doing intervals. Why, if you look at like the training journals of even runners who are more high intensity biased, most of their work, like 70% or more, is typically done at what we would consider a lower intensity.
Right.
Yeah, that made me
Good
think
answer.
of great answer. That made me think of like some of this time motion analysis you see with like how far, I think of the lacrosse player that you had done the post-op rehab for, and you programmed for, and you wrote a case study about, and just like keeping it real, and like what are they doing in their sport. And we actually know, because there's all these people that are studying how many accelerations they're having, how much are they reaching at top speed, and then the total mileage. And it's like, okay, we know all this stuff, so like who cares if it's aerobic, anaerobic, whatever, just make them be able to do those things and just keep it real.
Yeah, because to your point, I mean, I'm not like doing blood gas and pulmonary analyses on people to know that when I'm working with them that it's aerobic or anaerobic. I don't really think that it matters, but I mean, you could substitute lower intensity, higher intensity. Like glycolytic work is basically like moderate intensity work. Aerobic work is lower intensity work, and then your higher intensity work is like more of your sprinting. So a lot of the models are kind of saying the same thing. They just use different words. So as long as we kind of, and Steve Magnus talks about this, as long as we like see the commonalities between the models, it allows us to be less dogmatic about what we're doing. But, you know, to be clear and answer the question, like if you're doing an endurance type sport, where I would say like anything where your outputs have to last longer than like 60 seconds, you need to do aerobic work. Or you don't need to, but if you want to be, I think, as prepared as you can be, you should be doing a good deal of aerobic work or lower intensity work.
And you see so many runners in the city. are you finding like, are there certain distances, like say a runner wants to run a marathon versus a half marathon? Are you finding like commonalities for different runners on like the amount of mileage that they should be doing, or what you might recommend or find yourself recommending, like for per week, how many miles?
Well, it's funny because the person that asked the question, like his training history was doing a lot more like, like lifting for endurance, like higher rep lifting work, circuit type training, and then like low, like high intensity or higher intensity intervals, kind of like HIIT training. So for him, we always talk about, even when it comes to like movement, like we're just giving people what they need and what they don't have. And we're trying to find like, what have you neglected in your training to make yourself kind of a complete athlete, complete again, being relative to your goal. So for this athlete, like he wasn't doing really any aerobic work. So that's what he needs because he's neglected it. But for a lot of the other runners that I work with, they don't do any higher intensity work. Like all they do is like, they just run like 5 miles a day, every day, the same route. They don't really try to manipulate their pacing. It's kind of like the people you see at the gym where their workout is to like read the newspaper and go on the elliptical for an hour. And like, that's not bad, right? Like if your goal is just to like kind of be healthy and avert disease, like that might be good enough. But if your goal is to improve, you have to constantly be tinkering with something to get your body out of homeostasis. So for a lot of like the runners, the recreational runners I work with in the clinical practice, for them, they need to do more higher intensity work because they're like, well, I haven't improved my 5K time in 5 years. It's because you haven't asked your body to ever run faster than what your goal is. So if you're not running your goal pace, even at like a shorter distance, you can't expect to magically be able to take that goal pace and then expand it for a 5K or a 10K. So I think it depends on like what people aren't doing. I think most recreational runners tend to overdo it with the mileage, but like the elite runners, they tend to have it figured out. Like they're doing both, but
right. So you typically find that you're trying to reduce mileage with most of the people you come in contact with who aren't, being coached by somebody and have a program for them. It's just like, oh, I'm just going to go run because that's what I do.
Yeah. And it's not even that they're necessarily running like too many miles. It's that, look, you're running 6 days a week. It's not that I want you to like run 5 less miles a week or whatever, because if they're not getting injured, I don't really care. But it's like, let's just 1 or 2 days a week replace, just a longer run with something that we're emphasizing speed for a shorter volume. So that, again, because you want to build the bandwidth. Like a lot of people say, okay, I'm going to run a 5K. So they'll just run 3 miles a day. That specificity works to a point, but there's a reason why, the best runners in the world aren't just doing meets 3 days a week. They're trying to support their specific distance on the front end and the back end. And then depending on where they are in the season, they might kind of expand or contract that bandwidth, but you need some bandwidth to support the specific work you're doing. And a lot of the recreational runners aren't, in my opinion, supporting the bandwidth on the higher intensity end enough.
Cool.
Nice.
I think you beat that one up. That was nice.
Yeah, that was a great answer, Douglas.
What else do we have here? So that one's answered. Let's see. Nutrition's role in rehab, just a general topic to talk about. Trevor, you want to take that?
I mean, I would say like this is definitely not our area of expertise. Just as like simple guidelines, like I think, in terms of healing from an injury, like your body has to have enough energy to be able to heal itself. And if you're in a calorie deficit, when you're really trying to recover from even just training in general, like your recovery is going to be slower. You're not going to heal as well, especially in terms of like just having a surgery. So you got to make sure that you're eating enough calories in general. But yeah, like I would say, like we plan on having some actual nutrition experts on at some point in time to really kind of delve more into this topic. It's definitely a huge part of the rehab process and can make the rehab process a lot smoother if you really have good nutrition. But I would say, like as a general rule of thumb, it's making sure that you are eating enough calories, enough fats, enough proteins, enough carbs to make sure that your body can actually have the energy to heal itself.
Yeah, and I remember, I know a lot of times we're working with high school athletes when we're in New Jersey. When you're in New York, it's a little different, but it seems like a lot of the high school athletes that we see don't actually really understand like how much they're supposed to be eating, and they don't realize that, or maybe they know that they need to be eating more and they need more of whatever macronutrient, but they just don't actually realize how difficult it is to be eating the amount that they should be, where like they might be skipping breakfast every day just because they're too tired to, make it happen or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, that's something that I always find is like, it's hard to make the gains that we want, either, especially in rehab, but even in like performance training with the other athletes that are in the gym. It's like this constant conversation of making sure that they're eating something, because they could have a good week, but then, it's easy to get out of that habit for sure.
Well, and how many of those high school athletes do we hear talk about how they're like, they're not getting stronger right now, or they feel
Yeah.
like they're plateaued, and it's like, but I'm eating so much. It's like, okay, what'd you have for breakfast? It's like, I had 4 bowls of cereal. And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, that may be calorically a lot of calories, but it's not a lot of protein. It's almost zero protein. So they're just getting a ton of carbs without really getting any protein or anything else in their diet. And I think like
Right.
just that kind of thing alone, it's like what people think they're eating and what they're actually giving themselves are often two very different things.
Yeah, and I've seen that recently with like one patient that had an ACL surgery, at this point probably almost over maybe a year, maybe a little less than a year at this point. And like the goal with a lot of your rehab is like you got to build your muscle. Like that thing is just dead, and we got to build some muscle and get stronger. And if you're not eating breakfast or you're eating just cereal, it's probably not very helpful. So there's a lot of like very simple things that we recommend. Like most people aren't ready for all the detail that I'm sure like you've gone into with your coach, but
Yeah.
It's always just smaller recommendations. So yeah, it's a big role in rehab, I guess, is to sum up the answer to the question.
Right. It's very important.
Eat a lot of calories and eat enough to recover.
And just to kind of add to that, I mean, with any of these like performance-based professions, there's always going to be overlap. So like, how do you go to a nutritionist and not talk about exercise? I think it comes down to obviously like scope of practice, legalities, and then like, what are you actually comfortable talking about? Like, what are you educated about? So if somebody comes to me and asks a question about nutrition, I kind of look at it more of a screen. Like I want to make sure that I'm ruling out a red flag and they're not doing something to make themselves unhealthy. Like from a rehab standpoint, I think the biggest thing we're looking for is, are people like getting enough calories? Because I work with like even a lot of like endurance athletes, and some of whom like are on the continuum of disordered eating, and this is like males and females. So if I think like that's something that I'm identifying, that's probably a strong chance it's going to interfere with their recovery from an injury. And then like with a high school athlete, it's like, are you eating enough? And I'm not talking about like magic ratios, like this percentage carbs and this protein, but if you're
Right.
saying that you want to put on muscle and you're eating like 1,000 calories a day, you're not going to put on muscle no matter how much you lift. But I wouldn't be comfortable if somebody was like 8% body fat and they were like, how do I manipulate my nutrition to get down to 6%? I just don't have the expertise in that. And I don't think it would be fair of me to try to speculate, nor am I trying to like resolve someone's medical pathology. I think the biggest thing is I want to make sure that like nutrition is not the low hanging fruit. Like, is there like a health issue? Because if someone's like healthy enough, I mean, there are great athletes who eat McDonald's 5 meals a day. So it's like
True.
how much it actually matters from like a pure performance standpoint, I don't know. But I think that there is a point where like, if you're not eating enough, it can cause health problems, or if you're eating too much, right? Like the extremes are really easy to identify. So
yeah.
I'm trying to like identify extremes. And if I identify an extreme, I'm not going to be the one to tell them how to change it, but that's when I would refer out to another provider. So it's like, can we identify an extreme when it comes to eating? But if it's a really specific thing, like, even like, let's say an endurance athlete who's like, how do I do my in-race nutrition for an ultra marathon? I'm not the person to be doing that. That's where I would refer out. So like performance versus health, I think is a big thing when it comes to nutrition in the context of physical therapy.
Yep. Cool. I want to do one more question before we talk about that one topic that we wanted to talk about.
I'll be right back.
So let's talk about this question. Soft versus stiff landing. So what are the indications and benefits of doing each type of landing? So I'm assuming with jumps, maybe post-op, maybe not, doesn't really matter. Let's just talk all about that. So soft versus stiff landing. So for me, it's the ability to absorb force and then recreate it, right? So if you have a soft landing, you're absorbing your force in it, and you're giving yourself more time to absorb that force, loading your tissues probably and your joints a little bit more versus a stiff landing where you want to be bouncy and be more elastic. Talk more about that, Trevor. You've done so much with change of direction, and I think it sort of dovetails into.
I think what you just said is exactly like the most important part with just considering kind of why either one would be important. And it's like the force time principle. We can only produce force like in terms of how much we're interacting with the ground. So like you just said, if I'm landing really soft, I'm giving myself a ton of time to absorb force, so I have a much smaller impulse to deal with, versus if I land really sharp and I have a really relatively shorter ground contact time, I have more force to absorb rapidly, which is just harder to do overall and kind of need more strength for. So initially I want to start somebody with more quote unquote softer landings, where not the whole like land like a cat, don't let me hear anything, but I want to give them time to develop their rate of force development and control the motion a lot more than having them try to do something really quickly where they're probably just not strong enough and can't handle that amount of force yet. So we want to progress to a harder kind of landing. And I don't even think hard like stomping your feet. It's just kind of being sudden and being quick, learning how to generate tension really fast. So the sound somebody's foot makes definitely kind of tells me what's going on. And like one of the athletes I'm dealing with right now is a few months after their ACL injury. And you can just see the difference when we do skips in terms of how one foot hits the ground hard, and that's the one that is a non-injured extremity, versus the one that hits the ground a little bit softer, which is their injured extremity. You see, just in terms of how the foot contacts, they try to dampen force differently on the leg that has an injury because they're trying to give themselves more time to absorb force. So again, that's the kind of difference between the soft and the stiff landing, is just how much force are we having to deal with in a certain amount of time. And the longer time we have, the easier it is to deal with that force. We're essentially, by the softer ground contact or the longer time, we're giving them a longer runway to decelerate. So if I'm jumping from a 12-inch box and I have a soft contact, I'm giving myself a lot of time to absorb the force from falling from a 12-inch box. Versus if I hit the ground in a stiffer, kind of quicker tension position, I have to generate that force a lot quicker to stop my body. So again, that's the kind of difference, is just how much time am I giving myself to absorb and generate force.
Yeah, and I think it depends, on what the goal is too, right? I think that if you look at someone who's like characteristically a stiff lander and it's very, very bouncy, they tend to be the people that we look at and say, these are the better athletes, right? Because they have that gift of whether it's like long tendons, short muscle bellies, where they just don't spend a lot of time on the ground. And in a lot of sports that come down to speed, if you can produce force in a shorter amount of time, you tend to be able to create space and evade your opponent. But also like from a rehab standpoint, that's where people are more at risk for injury. And a lot of times the people that are like quote unquote twitchier, and we talked to Lee Taft about this, last week on that one call where we were like, obviously there's no way to look at an athlete and know who's more at risk for injury because people have different strategies, but the people that tend to have these stiffer, more explosive landings where they reverse force more quickly, they tend to have a more like joint centric versus a muscle centric strategy of changing direction. And they're probably more at risk for a catastrophic injury, but they're also faster. So a lot of times like the people that aren't explosive are the ones that oftentimes aren't as likely to hurt themselves because they're not strong enough or fast enough to do it. There's obviously exceptions to that, but then it depends on the sport too. Because if you look at like Barry Sanders, right? Like, yes, he was explosive and twitchy to a degree, but he was also very, very powerful. And like he could just stop on a dime using oftentimes a muscular strategy, like where his knee and his hip would go into quite a bit of flexion because he's accelerating and then all of a sudden stopping. And he's stopping to kind of create enough time to evade an opponent and come up with a new strategy to get down the field. So in like linear sprinting, for example, or like track and field and jumps, you probably want someone who's going to be a little bit more like just purely springy and stiff. But in a sport like football or a field sport, you probably want a little bit of a combination of both, because I think in Trevor, you know more about this than I do, but like to change direction, you have to be able to load to explode. And if you're just stiff all the time and you don't give yourself enough time to bend, it can be hard to produce the right angles to change direction outside the sagittal plane.
Yeah, your example of Barry Sanders, and there's a difference between like those kind of taller, longer athletes that are using relatively stiff, straighter limbs to change direction versus somebody like Barry Sanders who, call him like a squatty body, but can actually flex at their ankles, knees, and hips to be able to get appropriate plant angles. So they're using, I would say, like a concentric muscular strategy to change direction versus this kind of like stiff limb, lock out all my joints. I'm trying to create static muscular tension to be able to propel myself in the opposite direction. And like we're talking about with Lee, those are the people that they're relying on like passive restraints, like tendons and ligaments more, and bone contact more so than kind of more active stability and muscular tension. And I think, going back to the stiff landing thing, and we're talking about Barry Sanders, and like the flexion angles that he gets when he changes direction. Like when we see somebody, if I were to jump off that 12-inch box, I could still land soft with my legs straight, and I'm just absorbing force in my knees or my ankles or whatever joint I'm kind of biasing. Versus if I land soft, but I'm letting myself like hit the ground and then I'm flexing at my ankles, knees, and hips, I just use kind of two soft landings that have very different outcomes and different muscular outcomes, basically. So I'm using either like a really joint centric approach with that stiff landing, or I'm going to use muscular tension, but I'm still giving myself time to develop muscular tension by having a softer landing, versus if I'm landing kind of like in a squat and I stick it right away, where once I touch the ground, I don't move, versus when I touch the ground, I give myself time to yield and develop force. So again, like you said, Doug, it's just kind of, why do we want one versus the other? And I think from a return to sport standpoint, like we want to start with the easier one first, which is a softer landing, and eventually start progressing to harder landings that again fit their demands that they're going to have to be able to do.
And you brought up before with your patient with the ACL that you're working with now, it's like more of a fresh post-op case right now. And you mentioned how she was more, wait, what did you say? You said she was more stiff on her surgical side, right?
It's kind of interesting. Yes,
because I could see it both ways, and I feel like I have seen it both ways.
So there's two things that we've been kind of seeing with. So we do, as we're getting back into our running progression, I want to see people like hop and skip a ton before we start to get back to actual running, where you have single limb support versus double limb support with a double leg hop, or skipping, which is more like 1.5. So when we do double leg hopping, she yields on her non-surgical leg because she lets herself absorb more, versus when she's uncomfortable loading her surgical leg, she kind of locks her knee.
Right.
Versus when we do skipping, when she skips, she's able to put down the non-surgical leg a little bit more forcefully and abruptly. And then when she puts on her surgical leg, she puts down her toe a little bit more first, as she's just giving herself time to absorb force, because that's the difference between having 2 feet on the ground, where I can kind of save myself with my opposite side, or am I having to use my involved limb a lot more, where I have to now give myself time to be able to dampen it.
Right. So you can see it both ways. Yeah.
And again, like that just depends on the context and the person in general. So it's just interesting kind of seeing those things, like what's their strategy. And like we use our force plates in Jersey, and, I've seen people with similar cases to this case that we're talking about, where if we do an isometric mid-thigh flow, just to see where are they comfortable kind of generating force and tension right now. And it shows which leg, so your left leg versus your right leg. So if somebody has a right leg injury, when they do a mid-thigh pull, we may think that the left leg will show more force, but it's the right leg that shows that's being the dominant force, because they're letting that leg serve as the brake. So they're not exceeding what their force potential is with their opposite side. They're using their involved limb as a brake to cap wherever they are.
That's their governor.
And I think, yeah, exactly. So it's just kind of interesting to see like the strategies that people use, because some people, you do see the opposite, where they're like, okay, this leg hurts, I'm just not going to use it, but I'll go hard on my other one, versus, all right, this leg hurts, this is going to slow me down, I'm going to ride, like you said, let that be my governor, and that's going to be how much force I can actually have.
Yeah, I think this also kind of like is very similar to the question about the aerobic system, where you need to have bandwidth. So depending on what kind of an athlete you are, you need to train the stiffness end of things,
totally,
and the force side of things. And the sport's going to dictate like how big or small that bandwidth is. But you always, we hear about like the explosive strength deficit, and like, like where the counter movement vertical jump versus the non-counter movement. I kind of look at it like, if you had a really, let's say, like stiff, springy athlete, like you don't want to take that away from them, because that's usually what makes them good and better than everybody else. So you're not going to like stop training that, but you're just going to do enough strength work so that that's not like such a weak link that it can be exploited. So ultimately, like you're going to train plyos and you're going to train strength, regardless. I think that as long as you're exposing people to those things, like the things that need to shake out are going to shake out. That's why I don't get as like, I don't know about you guys, as crazy about, well, we have to find like this magic ratio between counter movement jump and non-counter movement, because a lot of times like the people that have the really bad non-counter movement jumps, they're the best athletes anyway. So are we gonna make them like more quote unquote explosive by having them like do like squats or weight room work? Or is the weight room work really serving more as just, it gives them more muscular support so that like when they do hit an angle they're not used to hitting, maybe they're not as at risk for injury because they're not going to impinge all the way or get to end range. I just think that like if you're a field sport athlete, you need strength work, you need explosive work, and it kind of, the sport itself kind of shakes it out. But I don't know if there's any magic ratio as far as that goes. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I would definitely agree with that.
You said it perfectly. Yeah, we're doing everything with everybody essentially, and then just sort of prioritizing what they don't have because of an injury, or if they don't have an injury, then still like what they don't have that they need for their sport, just whatever their goal is.
Yeah, like somebody who's super springy, like they should still be able to like have a decent squat and be able to reach decent depth. And if they can't, then it's like, that's probably a big red flag, or could be possibly a red flag for just what they have to be able to do on the court or on the field. So it's like, I want to just spend more time, like we always talk about, just giving them what they don't have. And same thing, somebody who has great mobility, like, yeah, I want to stiffen them up a little bit because they're probably not good at transferring force. So it's always
if you can dunk, if you can dunk, you should probably be able to squat. Like that's pretty safe to say. And we're just trying to give people some of that range and bandwidth that Doug's talking about.
Yeah, and like we're not talking about squatting 400 pounds. Like we've literally seen
not at all.
Who can like 360 dunk, but then when you ask them to like goblet squat, like, you know, a quarter of their body weight, like they can barely do it. So we're just looking to like, again, avoid extremes. Same thing with someone who's like, you know, who can squat 400 pounds. Like if they can't do a depth jump onto a 12-inch box without spending 5 seconds on the ground, like that's a problem too. So, and like Greg, you see this with baseball where I've seen people who can throw 90 miles an hour, but like they literally can't hold themselves in quadruped without like, you know, their scaps popping up in the air. So it's not like, we're not going to make somebody worse by having them do that. We're trying to, it's GPP. We're trying to make people human beings before like athletes. I don't know if what we do makes people like quote unquote more athletic. I think we're just giving them the raw materials to display whatever gifts they have so that they can self-organize in a way that they see fit. But if they're missing pieces of that, then it's really hard to self-organize. So that's why, I mean, I don't really know if somebody's like sport changes how I prepare somebody necessarily, because everyone's kind of ordering from the same menu, but it's just maybe they use different proportions of different things. But it's not like
I think that like that last point, Doug, of like it just changes how much of it we're doing. It's like then you would spend more time in deeper positions with somebody if they really suck at that versus somebody who's not springy, where you spend more time trying to get short ground contact times and really get them to develop tension quickly. It's always the same stuff. It's just the proportions change.
Right. It's like we're trying to make them better at what their sport doesn't really require of them, while also making them better at what their sport does require of them. Like, yeah, both. We could talk in circles about this. It's always both ends, and we're trying to,
No, but there's a school of thought. Like, do you try to take what, like, especially at the elite level, like take what makes somebody really good and give them more of it, or work on a weakness? I think that like, if we're talking about very specific, like on the field stuff, maybe you don't try to work on somebody's weaknesses as much, because then you're like, you're taking something away. But in the weight room, like if you work on someone's weakness, are you going to make them worse in the field? Like, I don't think that we make that much of a difference necessarily one way or the other. So but it's tricky because you can really justify it either way. Like, you know, if somebody who's got a 40-inch vertical leap, like if you do, you know, if you emphasize like low ground contact time work, are you really going to make them, are you going to add like a lot of, you know, inches to someone's vertical leap who can jump 40 inches? But at the same time, you can make a case that like, how much better are you going to make them if you do a ton of weight room work? So I think you're going to do both no matter what, and then just hope that it shakes free. And admittedly, like, I don't have a great answer for how much of each you should do. It's really just like a lot of guesswork and exposing people to a bunch of different things with a reasonable bandwidth relative to their sport, and then hoping that like they work it out on the field, you know?
Right. Yeah. All of this was one answer to one question about soft versus stiff landing. So that's awesome that we get these questions and just
good question.
We can keep going with it. All right. So last thing you want to talk about, Trevor and I had just kind of had a discussion yesterday about a patient he saw, and we talked about execution essentially, where we might see somebody who is doing or they have an exercise list, or they have a program that they're given by somebody else, and we might give somebody the same exact program. It might be the same exact exercise list, like sets and reps, whatever it is, who cares? But the execution of each of those items on the list is what we are finding can be a big sort of determination in how people wind up doing, either in their rehab or with pain or performance. Doesn't really matter. So you want to just talk about that a little bit, and maybe Trevor, you could bring up more about the example from yesterday.
We were just talking, so somebody came in with just a general, aches and pains kind of a thing, and told me about where they feel those aches and pains when they're training and all that good stuff. I did my assessment like we always do, and then gave them some correctives, or whatever you want to call, our movement prep, to be able to deal with some of those, mobility limitations that they had. And like almost the answer to every single one that I showed them was like, oh, I've done this before, or I'm already doing something like this. But then, we make these little bit of tweaks, like a modified pigeon stretch. They were doing a modified pigeon, but it's like, all right, let that opposite hip rotate down towards the table. And they're like, oh my God, it feels completely different. And there's just so many little things that I think we do from a clinical experience standpoint that gives us the insight into those little cues that we give our clients that really make the biggest bang for your buck with all the different exercises that we choose. And I think that's one of the reasons why we like to keep things very simple, but those simple things can be very effective if they're executed really, really well. Because I'm sure you guys have had too. You've had somebody come in who's like, oh, I'm doing a couch stretch. I was like, okay, show me your couch stretch. And it's their back's arched and their head's looking, their eyes are looking at the ceiling, and their chest is 6 inches in front of their butt. And then we get them into a different position, and it completely changes what they experience and what they feel with the movement. I just think that value of making sure we're doing the basics extremely well, doing the basics savagely well, really makes such a huge difference. And it can save people so much time, rather than giving them 35 more exercises that are trying to do the exact same thing.
Yeah, and it's not always the person that they've seen. It's not always like that person's fault necessarily, because they might have shown it the same way that we would have shown it to the patient or the client. And then, there's like a lost in translation there, where once the client leaves or patient leaves and they go home, then when they execute it, they're missing all the details because they're not with somebody. So it's not the clinician's fault necessarily, could or could not be, but it could also be, keeping things as simple as possible. Like almost like I try and find like, what is my one goal with this one thing that I want to do? So a couch stretch, like I want to stretch the anterior thigh. Like if that's the one goal, like I'm not going to care about anything else. And I'm going to try and give them person like one cue or like one thing for them to remember, and like have them tell me like, what do you think has helped you feel this stretch the most? And that's what I'm going to type in that email that I sent to them, because that's probably what's going to make it stick or make it more easy for them to replicate it. And then, obviously besides the videos that we send people too, but yeah.
Yeah. And that's, because we can go off on tangents with like all this stuff, but I think what this really comes down to with the execution piece, like, especially in physical therapy now, there's like, everything's like, tribalistic and in two camps. And you've got like kind of the biomechanical camp, where it's like everything has to be quote unquote perfect. And then you've got kind of the just load it camp, where it's like, look, the execution doesn't matter. And I'm using the extremes to make a point. I'm not saying that everyone's like this, but with the just load it, the idea is like, look, it's all about load tolerance. The execution doesn't matter as much as developing a tolerance for a position and then just gradually building up that tolerance. But I think that like, regardless of what you're doing, there needs to be an intent behind it. So even your intent might not be necessarily pain reduction, right? Because pain is a complex phenomenon, but it could be, and like, at least for my evaluation, I think we kind of treat similarly. Like I'm giving somebody something to do because during the evaluation, there was something that I thought was important that they didn't have, whether it was for pain reduction or performance. So it's like, if you are missing a ton of hip extension and you play a sport that requires hip extension, whether you hurt or not, I want you to have that, because also like you're a human being and you should have some amount of hip extension. We're looking for the extremes, and a lot of really good athletes often test extreme in a not great way, whether they have pain or not. So if we're having somebody do a movement and the goal is to promote hip extension, if they're doing it, but they're not actually extending their hip, they're just going through the motions, then like, we're not saying to be judgmental, like, oh, you're moving poorly. It's like, no, we have an intent behind what we're doing. So to me, the execution always matters because you should have an intent. Even if the intent is just the ability to tolerate load, like, all right, well, depending on where you, like the position you put somebody in, that's going to determine where the force goes. So like, where are you trying to develop the ability to tolerate load? What part of the body, what joint are you trying to bias? Because the execution dictates where that force is going to go. So even if you're in like the just load it camp, there should be an intent behind what you're doing. And that intent should dictate the manner in which you teach the movement and the execution. So I think execution is always very important. It might not be popular to say that now because people can think of it as judgmental. It's not judgmental. It's like we're trying to be purpose and intent driven. And if we don't emphasize execution, then what's really our role as like movement professionals is kind of my opinion on it.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm just now remembering a patient from yesterday who said she likes to do deadlifts at home and with her exercise program when she's back at the gym. And it's like, okay, let's go over, show me, here's the kettlebell, like show me how you deadlift. And it's almost like two people might give the same exact exercise and they're just completely different things because of how the patient does them. So it's more about like the details of how it's done. We probably care more about than like what someone's actually doing. Like you could squat or deadlift, I could care less, but you better do it like really well.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're loading your lower body. I think we would all agree we don't care too much about like quad versus hamstring dominance or glute dominance or whatever. It's just like we want to load the lower body, like pick a deadlift or a squat, but they should be done really well, and it doesn't really matter.
Well, so like I like your point about like intent, Doug, because I think we would all say like there's really, we don't believe in like a bad movement, like a just like this exercise is bad. Like a squat's not bad. Maybe how you're doing it isn't the best for you at this moment in time or whatever kind of rationale. But it's just about having that sort of intent behind the execution, like the dip thing that we talked about last week. Like we don't really give a lot of people dips just for the sake of giving people dips. But if we do have like, you know, somebody who's going like a wrestler who's going to get their shoulders in really crazy, funky positions, like they got to be able to control those positions and they should be strong there. So that's a case where we would give somebody that exercise for a certain reason, but that doesn't mean that we don't care how that dip looks. We still want to have that dip done with really, really good execution and just high quality movement that meets, you know, the standard of what a good dip looks like, whatever that is to the coach.
Yeah. And I think you have to, allow for some idiosyncrasies with movement. Like people are going to have their own signature, but I think as the provider, you have to have some standards, and that the standards allow for some flexibility, but like, why are you doing what you're doing? Even with going back to the intent thing, like people do like Jefferson curls. And there was a movement where people were like physios were just saying, oh, just everyone should do Jefferson curls just to prove that like you can do it and not herniate a disc. But like, is that a good reason? Like, are you doing something just to prove that it's not bad? Or is there an intent behind it? Like, if you're working with like a wrestler, let's say, who has to, like throw somebody from like these disadvantaged positions, then that exercise might make sense. But like, there's a reason why like a power lifter who is like their goal is to lift as much weight as possible in competition, even if their like lumbar spine visibly moves under load in their setup, they're not trying to get their spine to end range. It might happen during the setup because they're working at a maximal load, but no one is like deliberately saying that deadlifts over like 500 pounds, like, yeah, like let's take your lumbar spine to end range and then rip it off the floor. So it always comes down to intent. And if your goal, like with the Jefferson curl, is like you actually want to bias the erectors, then go ahead and do it. But if you're doing it just because you're trying to like, be like a contrarian and oppose this like movement perfection thing, like I don't think we get wrapped.
It's a hashtag thing.
Yeah, like we don't get wrapped up in these like you should do it this way or that way. It's like, what's the person's goal, and everything else is kind of politics and kind of almost a waste of time, in my opinion.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think that's enough for this one. You guys have anything else?
No, I think this was good.
I think that was really good. I think we had some good questions, and I'm looking forward to doing more of these. This was good.
Keep them coming.
Thanks,
Definitely.
everybody.
Thank you. Keep it real.
Keep it real.